歡迎收睇滙豐 Premier Elite 財富滙談，我係代表滙豐投資總監辦公室嘅 Ravel。一如市場預期，美國聯儲局喺10月會議上面再次減息25個基點，將聯邦基金利率目標區間降至3.75至4厘。聯邦公開市場委員會重申，最近幾個月就業增長放緩，風險上升，但係經濟溫和增長，同時通脹亦然略為較高。聯儲局主席喺發佈會上面表示，根據經濟前景嘅變化，12月唔一定會再進一步減息，理由係經濟活動比較預期強勁，勞動市場亦冇急速轉壞嘅情況，令委員會之間出現觀點上嘅分歧。加上由於美國政府持續關閉，傳統經濟嘅數據發布中斷，亦都令到聯儲局更為謹慎。亞太經合組織第32次領導人非正式會議星期四喺南韓舉行，中美兩國元首係相隔多年首次會晤。聯儲局喺10月底宣布再次減息，對投資市場有咩影響呢？今集滙豐 Premier Elite 財富滙談，請嚟滙豐環球投資研究亞洲首席經濟師范力民。Great to have you here, Frederic.
Thanks for the invitation.
So, Frederic, could you share with us what's driving the Fed's latest decision to cut rates?
So the Fed, of course, has a dual mandate. That means they're targeting not just inflation, but also the unemployment rate. And what we've seen in the US is that inflation remains above the target for the Fed, but the labor market shows signs of weakening. For example, companies are laying off workers, the unemployment rate is rising. And that's why we see, therefore, the Fed getting a bit concerned and having to start to cut interest rates, is to provide that softness, soft landing for the economy, cushion the landing, if you will. So that's what they're focusing on, the labor market, more than inflation at the moment.
Right. So it seems that the Fed wants to ensure the economy achieves a soft landing rather than an economic hard slowdown. So, Frederic, how does this monetary easing policy different from the previous rate cut cycles?
So we could probably say that inflation remains relatively high for a Fed rate cut. So in the past, we would have seen inflation come down more before the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates. But that's not the only difference. Of course, the other difference is that equity markets remain relatively high at the moment. And generally, the Fed doesn't cut interest rates with asset markets performing so well, because it means the economy is performing well. And so it's a bit unusual that you have the Fed cutting, even though inflation is high and financial markets are still doing well.
Right. Previously, when a Fed rate cut is coupled with a resilient economy, equities market have resulted in a positive return 12 months after the first rate cut. US equities and global equities have resulted in 21% and 15% respectively in the previous rate cuts. So the combination of Fed rate cut, better than expected earnings growth, and the AI-led innovation should continue to support US equity. Frederic, as we step into the end of 2025, what's our HSBC outlook for the Fed's rate path going into the next 2 years?
So there might still be a rate cut in there, so we might get potentially a rate cut before the end of this year. But if you look beyond that, if you look into 2026, into 2027, it's not clear that the Fed has that much room to cut interest rates. Now, the market is pricing in more rate cuts by the Federal Reserve next year, but there is still a lot of inflation in the US, and growth because of the AI boom is actually holding up well. So it's not clear that the Fed can actually deliver as many rate cuts as financial markets are currently expecting. So we're a bit more cautious on how many more rate cuts the Fed really can deliver in 2026.
Right, Frederic. But one thing is for certain is that cash rates are coming down. And as a result, investors could potentially move out of excessive cash holdings and lock in yields through quality bonds. One last question for you, Frederic. So how is this a US Fed rate cut impact Asian economies?
So generally it's positive, of course. When the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates, that means there's lower funding costs in Asia as well. That's good for investment here. Investment drives economic growth. But we also have stronger US growth potentially. If the Fed cuts interest rates, then that supports US growth and therefore exports to the United States. And therefore, generally speaking, rate cuts by the Federal Reserve are positive for Asian economies.
Right, so US Fed rate cut is generally positive for Asian economies. Capital inflows into Asian bonds and equities could pick up as investors look beyond the US for yield opportunities. Therefore, it is critical for our investors to stay diversified across different regions, sectors, and asset classes in your investment portfolios. So, Frederic, thank you for your invaluable insights today.
Thank you very much.
今日我哋時間差唔多啦，我哋先傾到呢度。